When Michael asked me to talk here about primitive accumulation, I was under the impression that what we're going to be talking about is the relationship between primitive accumulation and industrial capital accumulation. And my point of the talk is going to be that we've now moved beyond industrial capital accumulation back towards primitive accumulation, except that whereas the original primitive accumulation, as described by Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, was primarily military in the first instance, followed by seizure of the land. Now you have finance achieving what military force used to. Now, Marx described, since the previous speaker described Marx in Capital, what he talked about was the idyllic proceedings of the chief moments of primitive accumulation. And he began fairly late in the story. He didn't begin with the looting of Byzantium in the 13th century that provided Europe with the silver and gold that really fueled the whole growth of banking and commerce. He began with the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, the enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for commercial hunting among blackskins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And also Rosa Luxemburg followed this. She said militarism fulfills a quite definite function in the history of capital, accompanying it as it does every phase of accumulation. But the whole idea for Marx was that the point of accumulating capital by military looting and then by commerce was supposed to create a stock of capital investment that then was going to be used to employ wage labor to begin producing goods and services at a markup, at a profit. And when Marx said profit, he means basically what we Wall Street analysts call cash flow, or EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It meant all the surplus over and above the actual cost of production. Now, the way in which the capitalist, industrial capitalism took off was indeed with a dependent labor force, and once you invaded a country, the next thing you had to do was what England's landed aristocracy did, which is take control of the land, and then you drive the labor off that into the cities, where they have no choice but to work for wages, and that's when you have the wage labor turning into the source of profits. And so the idea of industrial capital to Marx was to employ labor to produce goods and services to sell at a markup, which is profit or cash flow. That's obviously not what we're seeing today. The question that I think we should all describe is, how did we go from this system that was pretty optimistic in Marx's description? Finally, okay, we're not in the looting phase anymore. Now we're in the domestic phase. How do we get to a capital accumulation that was supposed to be a driving process? How do we end up to today's austerity programs over the whole world and the economic shrinkage? When it comes to population, I want to say one thing about James Stewart that Michael Perelman mentioned. James Stewart wrote Principles of Political Economy. That was also the title of David Ricardo's book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. It was the title of John Stuart Mill's book, Principles of Political Economy, with some of their applications to social problems. And the only exception to calling a major book Principles of Political Economy was by Adam Smith. in the wealth of nations. And he didn't want to call his book Principles of Political Economy because his publisher was James Stewart's publisher. He didn't want the same title as James Stewart. He wanted to really drive James Stewart out of business. That was his task, and Marx goes into this quite a bit in his Theories of Surplus Value. And the first translator, Terence McCarthy, who translated this as History of Economic Doctrines, had in his introduction a discussion about how Smith was to replace Stewart there. And Stewart was characterized as a mercantilist, and it was Smith who used this, but they were really political arithmeticians. Stewart was the last great monetary theorist before Smith, integrating finance into the industrial capitalist process. And I think it's very important to read Stewart. I bought my copy of his Principles of Political Economy 50 years ago in a copy that was photocopied or made by photography in Japan and bound to look like the original edition of Stewart, which was actually rarer than the Stewart's book itself. Well, at any rate, the whole point of capital accumulation is to be in a position to employ labor, to produce manufactures, to sell at a profit. Accumulation was seizing the land to produce. There was some discussion about the role of technology in how is that going to displace labor as capitalists continue to find machinery to produce cheaper than labor. Isn't this going to disemploy labor? And you find a lot of discussion on the left today. In book 2 of Marx's Theories of Surplus Value, he discusses Ricardo, and he showed how a permanent crisis was impossible under capitalism for technology, because he says the more rapid the rate of technological improvement, the faster existing physical capital becomes obsolete, and you're going to have an increasing employment of labor in Department 2 in the capital goods industries to make the new capital that will displace the old capital. So Marx rejected the idea of technology as leading to unemployed labor. What is happening today is quite different. You mentioned the role of population. I want to say one thing in. You have essentially in neoliberalism a financial plan of takeover. You now no longer have to conquer a country militarily to take over its land or to take over the public sector. Most of the fortunes of wealth is the French novelists noticed, such as Zola and the others, were by seizing the fortune from the public domain. Almost all the great fortunes, including the railroad fortunes that Michael has talked about, were taken from the public domain. They were, and that was their form of primitive accumulation. If you want to see primitive accumulation in the modern world, just look at what the European Troika is doing to Greece. It said, you owe the money, you have to pay the debts, sell off your land, sell off the Acropolis, sell off the island, sell off your tourist sites, and especially the oil rights in the Aegean and Mediterranean. That's what they're after. You also mentioned the precarious worker. The phrase used by Alan Greenspan's biographer was the traumatized worker. Alan Greenspan explained to Congress, first of all, he was an aficionado of pension fund capitalism, of saving. Alan Greenspan said in his two testimonies before the Senate Banking Committee that this recent, since 1980, the whole recovery of the American economy has been marked by the fact that wages haven't gone up at all since the late 70s. And how is this? And Alan Greenspan said, it's brilliant. The workers have all gone into so deeply into debt to buy their houses that if they go on strike or if they're fired from their jobs, all of a sudden they'll miss a mortgage payment, they'll be three mortgage payments away from homelessness. Not only that, but now that they're forced to increase their standard of living by going into debt, by taking out the second mortgages that Greenspan was encouraging them to do, to take out the equity in their houses by going into debt, and by living off their credit cards. If they miss a telephone payment or a credit card payment or any monthly payment, their credit card rates of interest go up to 29%. So the workers can't afford to complain anymore. They can't afford to take a risk. And so you have what was called the traumatized worker effect in here. And the great, what finance capitalism has discovered since you have the pension fund capitalism in the 1950s is there's another way of exploiting workers. The financial sector realizes that it's much easier to exploit workers not by employing them. If you employ workers, you have to go to all the trouble of producing things. You have to develop new markets, you have to invest in machinery, you have to employ advertising to promote the goods. It's much easier to simply exploit them financially. First of all, you have them contribute to a pension fund, and the company contributes to a pension fund, which can be done in two ways. Either it's turned over to the financial sector to manage, usually in corporate rating to downsize the labor force, or it's an employee stock ownership program. Such as the Chicago Tribune had, 50% of the employee stock ownership programs already at the time that pension fund capitalism started were bankrupt. You saw in the Chicago Tribune when Sam Zell bought the Tribune, he borrowed the money against the stock that the workers had. Then he drove the Tribune bankrupt. That wiped out the pensions. This is the strategy now. In a way, it's what the Russians call Gravattization. It's easier, cheaper to grab sources and sums of financial capital than it is to actually loot the gold and silver, where you actually had to employ workers to dig out the gold and silver in the mines of Latin America and Africa and the other places. So finance has become the new mode of achieving what it used to take an army to do. Putin in Russia said that privatization and financialization of the Russian economy since 1991, and especially under Yeltsin's after 1994, had destroyed more Russian population than the 22 million Russians who died in World War II. So you have the effect of privatization everywhere that it's extended as shrinking the population. In the country that I specialize in, Latvia, Latvia has lost 20% of its population through emigration since the neoliberals really imposed their program after the year 2000. It was at the time of independence from Russia in 1991, Latvia had 2.2 million population. The current official number is 2 million if you count all the visitors to Latvia, all the Latvian visitors, all the foreigners who own the land, and demographers say that it's now 1.8 million. That's the equivalent of 40%. But even if you take the numbers that the government reports, 20%, you would have to have, in America, which is now being held out, if only you could be like Latvia. Follow the Latvian model. That's what the Greeks were told, the Americans are told. 50 million Americans will have to emigrate in the next 10 years in order to duplicate the Latvian model. I don't think there are enough courses teaching Chinese to enable them to find jobs abroad for all of this. So, that's really the problem. You're having exactly the opposite. We are now in the shrinkage part of capitalism, and the fact is, Marx did not call primitive accumulation capitalism. He called it just plain looting. The neoliberals call it privatization. The Russians call it Gravattization, but it's all basically the same thing. It does not involve money being invested in commodity production turning into more money. It's making money off money. And as long as you can get other countries to agree not to oppose, just cancel their foreign debts and annul them, like the U.S. states did in the early 19th century, then you have a voluntary payment of the foreign debts by means of just turning the property over. And on the right wing of the spectrum throughout Europe, you have the Marxists parties, or the parties that begin as the Marxist parties. The right wing throughout the world now are the Social Democrats, the Labor Party, and the Democratic Party in the United States. These are the parties that are supporting the bankers, as if somehow supporting the bankers is supporting what is going to finance industrial capitalism. But the banking sector, the finance capitalism, is not financing industrial capitalism. Marx had believed that the natural technological way of capitalism to develop would be that finally the role of industrial capitalism was to liberate Europe from feudalism. It was going to get rid of the landlords, it was going to get rid of the bankers and take them into the state, and the effective democracy was going to be to enable labor to get the vote, and labor would act in its self-interest. Somehow you have the labor parties and the labor unions throughout the world acting diametrically against the interests of labor by supporting the banks, so that in Greece it was the leader of the Social Democrats, the party, the Socialist Party there, who at the time was the head of the Socialist International, Papandreou, who agreed with the European Union, yes, we're going to privatize, and he said, we should have a vote. Angela Merkel said, no, you can't have a vote. They'll vote against it. So Papandreou said, you're absolutely right. We're the Socialist Party. We don't let the people vote. His popularity rating fell to 8%, and thank God the socialists were thrown out of power. They were being thrown out of power in almost every European country, especially in the other country I'm involved in, Iceland, where the socialists and the Social Democratic Party were the only party in Iceland supporting Gordon Brown in England, saying, you Icelanders have to pay for all of the branches that lost money in England because of my light touch, because they lost money, and even though you're not legally obliged to pay, even though we British are obliged to pay, you Icelanders have to agree to pay because otherwise I'll be embarrassed. The socialists were all in favor of paying. And it was the socialists in Iceland that are insisting that the banks index their mortgages to the exchange rate so that the banks won't lose any money, because the labor unions in Iceland are heavy holders of the bank stock, and he said the interests of labor is supporting the pension funds of labor, even if that means cutting employment by 90%. So that's the Social Democratic Party you have in Europe. Now the political question is, how are we as Marxists going to fight against the Social Democrats and the labor parties throughout the world?
Questions, comments?
Dismantling of the command, part of the Primitive Accumulation story, in the form of the Soviet Union was self-Gravattization, but in China, it's very different.
We should take, I think there are a lot of questions. We should take
Could you explain what happened in Iceland then? Talk a little bit about what happened in Iceland.
I actually am a professor of labor studies in China. So I've lived there for half of each year for the last 10 years, and I would be delighted to talk about that, but also ask for some deeper analysis from some of the Marxist experts here.
I've got a question about semantics. Why are we still with primitive accumulation instead of Harvey's phrase, accumulation by dispossession? Just insofar as, if I remember my Harvey correctly, he coins that phrase because he wants us to understand that this dispossession is in effect an ongoing characteristic of capitalism, and not just what Marx talked about as sort of the secret to the original concentration, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And I'll chime in on China. I'd like to hear a little more from David or any of you about, yes, we have this 3 billion global reserve of army, but what is it about particularly about China? Is it something with regard to education, the role of the state, the role of the Chinese Revolution that has made it particularly the zone of accumulation that did pull, I agree with David, pulled capital out of its crisis in the 70s? Why China? Yeah.
I'm only an amateur economist, but what I wonder about any kind of accumulation is how do we reverse the trend of corporations sucking the economic resources out of our economies and then hiding from taxes. Of course, they use all kinds of globalization shell games. And it seems as though they're more powerful than governments, and it's become this horrendous monster. And then austerity is the antidote.
Yeah, I think it's, obviously it resonates to talk about the land grabs and so on. It's harkening back to what Marx was talking about, primitive accumulation. But I'm wondering if it's appropriate to use that framework to talk about something like grabbing pensions and privatization, because in one sense, this was all a product of a balance of forces in the class struggle internationally after World War II, in which social democracy resurged with discredited capitalists in Europe, and then the New Deal in the United States, which was tolerated for some generations. But once that balance shifts, yes, let's grab everything. And it's also part of, I think about primitive accumulation. Why not we're lowering the social wage, we're lowering compensation generally, we're trying to reindustrialize the economy on the basis of a low wage, low social wage, and cheap energy. Is that the same as primitive accumulation? It's an attempt to deal with a changing balance of power in the capitalist system internationally with China and other newly industrializing countries. So does that, I'm just wondering if it's correct to use primitive accumulation to talk about some of this way it's driven forward, is that really appropriate are we overgeneralizing it by bringing it to those situations?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering what people see as the limits of this new way of doing things. I mean, obviously, like running out of markets is one, or labor rebellion is another. I'm just wondering how far you're seeing capitalists can go on with this. And the other half of that question is, what is happening to the capitalist class? I mean, it seems like the poorer capitalists must be dropping out of this whole thing.
You answer first. Let's answer.
Yes. Let's try some answers. I have a few short remarks. One is, about 25 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, I was at a meeting of the Western Economics Association, and I heard a familiar guys that went away. And it was Milton Friedman, who was gloating about 100 million unemployed workers in China and how they'll just trash the union movement in the United States. How he was just jumping up and down with all 5'3" or whatever he is. Fortunately, he's not jumping anymore. In terms of the word primitive accumulation, its origin is so nice that I'm attracted to it. I should have talked about the origin in my talk. It's very quickly this. Adam Smith talked about original accumulation, as where did it come from? And it was like he was looking for the Big Bang of capitalism. And he never answered it. Marx quoted this in Capital, and it was translated back into English from the German as primitive, to get a sense of the barbarism of it. And that's where primitive accumulation comes from. He then quoted Robert Torrens, another major British economist, and a colonel also, who said it happened when the first person picked up a tool and made it. And Marx then played with this word of shtick and stock,
and said, you know, the first man picks up stock, and it's a stick, and that's the origin of his discussion of primitive accumulation. It's such a nice story. In terms of where capitalism's going, I wanted to title one of my books, Down the Tubes on the Haitian Road to Development. Meaning, what we're trying to do is what Ruth is suggesting, trying to kind of compete with Haiti and the other low-wage countries in order to revitalize capitalism, as if that's the way to go. Now, it's very interesting. I did not talk about, a major part of my talk was going to be about the American economists who were trained in Germany, who were respectful of Marx, didn't like his politics, but respectful of his economics. And they had a very different take, and they started talking about the economy of high wages. And this was accepted in United States economics until around the middle of the Hoover administration. Hoover still, he said the way to improve the economy is to have high wages, which forces companies to industrialize. Of course, this doesn't work when you have an open economy. And then I really should let our other panelists. As a professor in China, you have
Marx described governments as the board of directors of the capitalist class. But today, central banks are the boards of directors, not of the industrial capitalist class, but of the financial class. And when you have the European Troika doing what it's doing in Greece and the others, it's acting on behalf of the banks, not the industrialists. And I think that's how in China, the central bank isn't running things. As it happened, Milton Friedman was invited to the Shanghai about 40 years ago. And so what you have in China is a kind of unique formulation of Thatcherite Marxists. For instance, just let's look at history. As you know, China is only 30 years old. It didn't exist as a country before there. All of a sudden, it was just invented, and all the stuff that you see has only been built in the last 30 years. It was a desert before there, nothing was built. That's the story you get whenever you visit China. Look at we've done. Nobody mentions Mao except in Beijing and further off in the West, and it's just amazing how it is as if they didn't see that in between the old imperialist control of China and what they've done now, Thatcherite Marxism, you had the Mao clean the slate. And if you read Mao's earlier workings, one of the big discussions they had is, what are you going to do with the excess workers that Mao called the lumpen proletariat? He said, what are you going to do with the fact that all over China you have beggars? And he said, you can't look at them as they're not the vanguard of the working class, certainly. There's nothing really you can do. But if you look at any of the images of how China was under Chiang Kai-shek, under the others, all you see is poverty anymore. You don't see that at all anymore. And yet you had this Maoist interregnum that entailed the famine, that entailed the force, but it was all under something I don't think that you can call what happened in Russia state capitalism really, but you can call what happened in China state capitalism, when the state really decided how to develop industry and how to develop what actually is the largest sector in any economy, and that's real estate. If you're talking about capital accumulation and you're looking at statistics, you've got to look at the actual statistics. Most of the capital is invested in buildings and, of course, in the public infrastructure. That's what they did in China. They built the real capital that a society needs, the infrastructure, the buildings. Russia for some reason, was never able to have a construction industry. Just go to Russia or any of the satellites, especially in East Germany, the buildings are physically falling down. down. Nobody is ever going to want to pay more money for a pre-war building, in the Soviet Union or Germany or the Baltics than as they would here in New York. They couldn't do it. In China, the building is much better. So all of a sudden, you had the state planning the industry, working at admittedly low wages, because why are they low? If you have an American budget, most of the money goes for rent, for housing, and for finance. In China, they didn't have the high real estate. They didn't have the high housing costs. And although they had low wages, their wages were paid thoroughly on the goods and services, and they could afford them. So China could afford to undersell. Now there's a whole transformation. The whole issue before the current regime that's coming to power in China is now it's time where Europe is dead. America's turning into a dead zone. We have to depend on the internal market. Now they're going to raise the wages, and for the first time, you're going to have an internal market. The only problem is how do you prevent people from wasting their money on cars and pollution, and you can't imitate the consumer program patterns that you have in the West because just of the pollution and the traffic jams you'd have. But the whole idea is now you're having the transition to a high wage economy in China, basically.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, but maybe also pull out some of the differences of emphasis among us on the panel. The heart of my argument was to insist that wage labor remains central to the workings of the global economy today. And my response to Michael's formulation earlier that we've shifted to financial exploitation of workers is to say, to financially exploit workers, they first have to have wages. Otherwise, what are you going to be able to exploit them for? In other words, I agree there are new modalities of financial appropriation. There's no question about that. But not only are there workers with wages, but the trend of the neoliberal period, as I was trying to highlight, has been an enormous expansion in the global working class. And the thing I would emphasize about China is that you are talking, for instance, about thousands and thousands of factories that did not exist 20 or 25 years ago. Some of them utterly massive complexes of tens of thousands of workers working in integrated production facilities. I mean, China has not simply been through, but it has been through this enormous real estate and building boom. It has been through the most compressed industrial revolution in human history. The process of industrialization has been much more rapid, dramatic, and compressed. I mean, you're talking than in, say, Britain. You're talking about some hundreds of millions of people who have moved from the land into urban wage labor. Many of these are as migrants. That is to say, they don't have the full legal rights in the cities. They are internal migrant laborers who still belong to their villages. And this gives them a second-class sort of status internally, which is why migrant labor figures so powerfully. Something in the area maybe of 200, 250 million people who constitute the internal migrant labor force in China today. And that, Paul, in terms of your question, that's why I want to keep on Marx's term of primitive accumulation. My worry is that in the discussion, there's been a tendency, and of course this was part of the debate around David Harvey's book that took place in the journal Historical Materialism, where some people said it's been equated with looting and predatory practices. And I think the question from Lee here earlier was getting at this too, that if we simply equate accumulation by dispossession with looting, we forget the other side of Marx's argument, which is he says, the essence of the process is the separation of direct producers from the land. Their push onto the labor market and their transformation into wage laborers or part of the global reserve army. And I see that process as still central to the workings of global capitalism today. And that's why, like a number of commentators, I'm quite taken by those places where Marx says, primitive accumulation kickstarts capital accumulation and then is reproduced as internal to and integral to capital accumulation. He says there's multiple places across capital, and I agree with that. And so it's one of the reasons why I like to keep that term. And finally, on the question, what are the limits of this current mode of accumulation? I can't do any justice, but it's a great question, Ruth. But I would say this. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that the recovery of profitability since about 2009, particularly in the United States, has been driven by increased rate of exploitation of labor. Put simply, workers have been rendered more productive while their wages have been effectively stagnant. That's driving up the rate of exploitation. But Marx tells us that to exit a period of crisis, capital needs not only to restore profitability by more effective exploitation of labor, but also to destroy existing capital and replace it by revolutionizing the means of production. That is to say, it needs a new investment boom, a new wave of accumulation that gets rid of the least profitable capitals and allows another cycle of accumulation to take off. I believe that has not happened in any significant sense. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is because marginal capitals can stay alive so long as interest rates are zero. I mean, basically, so long as you can just get the money, you can keep your cash flow going. And so we're in this funny period of high unemployment. Profits have rebounded, but there's no new wave of investment. Unemployment stays very, very high, especially for the young, and I think that's going to be a real limit, and we're seeing it from Taksim Square to everywhere right now, those youth rebellions against this moment.
One quick comment, and we'll have more questions. And that is the depression in the 1870s that I talked about. The depression in the 1870s was created because of the rapid destruction of capital. At one point, Andrew Carnegie shut down a factory that had been in operation for only 2 months. Leveled it because he heard of a better technology. The problem with this, and Marx is clear about this, is that you have to have the capital working for enough time to be able to pay for itself. Otherwise, the rapid reindustrialization or destruction of capital is so fast that it cannibalizes the economy. So it becomes unsustainable. Unsustainable. Okay, now questions.
Thank you. Thanks for a fascinating panel and I'm also tensions between the various speakers. So I have a couple of questions. My question for David. David, I mean, I think that chapter 25 is absolutely fascinating. And it's called the general law of capital accumulation, and I think it is a mark of the deep humanism of Marx, that the general law of capital accumulation is directly connected with the law of population. And I think that that's a brilliant thing, but I think that Marx was much more social than you're giving him credit for. Because I think that there are senses, I mean, you talk about Ireland, but also within England, there's a sense in which Marx is saying that people who are forced to reproduce themselves at very low levels of technology and productivity have more children. And this is, in a sense, what's happening also at a global scale, so I'd like your comments on that. I also like your comments, secondly, on the argument that Hudson Thompson originally made, and now in Hurst Thompson and Bromley, that levels of migration up to 1914 as a proportion of the world population were much greater than they have been since. And of course, in one sense, when you talk about the rise of remittances, I mean, that's actually, you only get remittances when you get temporary migration. If I take my kit and caboodle and all my kids, I'm not going to send any remittances to anybody. So I think that's a very important part of the problem. And then I have a question, it's a very specific one for Michael, because it's a very empirical one. What proportion of working class people do you think in the United States were actually the recipients of mortgages and in general and of subprime mortgages in particular? Because I mean, I just want to know the answer to that, because I sometimes think that the trade-off between wages and credit is exaggerated in the last decade in the United States, but I could be wrong. And then finally, two quick points for everybody. Number one, I would have thought that when we talk about primitive accumulation, we talk about land. And in this respect, I want your comments on the causes of the recent food price increases. and the relationship to peasant agriculture and so on, and none of you talked about the service sector. I agree with you, we're still living in a labor economy, but everybody talks about manufacturing. I want to talk about services.
Just on the mortgages, 20% of mortgages were subprime. And some of these
That's not my
mortgages-
question.
Well, no, I'm getting to that. Some of the mortgages that went bad were given to poor people who owned their houses outright, and then the house was overvalued and a second mortgage was put on and they defaulted on that. So there was sort of a taking going on. My question is just really narrow, and that is the AFL-CIO, I think it is, supporting the immigration bill, and their reasoning appears to be that if there's more immigration, that they can unionize the migrants. Is that making the wrong bet?
I have a question which I see as another mechanism of accumulation. That is the difference between the official inflation rate that the government declares and the actual inflation rate, and the amount of interest that's paid on savings. So a bank can get assets and next year get much more for their assets in terms of the currency, and the official accumulation rate is 1% or whatever they're paying on savings, and the government's official rate of inflation, which is much undervalued in regard to the true rate of inflation.
I have a question for Michael Hudson. Talk a little bit about quantitative easing programs and the role that
Just speak louder.
you could talk about the quantitative easing programs and their role in primitive accumulation.
Yeah, just in regards to this, the idea that the only way to exit from a deep crisis is to destroy a lot of capital. It always seems to me that it's not just political, a superstructural political issue, so to speak, that have the drive to war, but that the war is itself an economic necessity at a certain point in the logic of the development of capital. And in the situation we have right now, you need a big war, because you need to destroy some serious capital.
The other questions are going to take us till the end of the time.
One question, I'll just talk about the question about the rate of inflation and good understanding. If you take an idea and you create it as intellectual, you call it intellectual property, then you can escalate the price, and that gives the illusion of increasing productivity where it's just a bookkeeping question, not really productivity. Does that make sense? So there are all sorts of things that count as productivity. The productivity of bankers who are speculating on derivatives will count as productivity. We do not have good understanding of what's going on in terms of productivity in the economy. I do want to say one other thing about China is, from my understanding of my time there, and I'd like to get your comment as one of the discussions about it, but they're trying to upgrade the migrant workers and trying to raise wages to force themselves up the value chain to allow them to be more competitive in the economy. Okay.
If I were giving a theoretical explanation, which I didn't have time for, I would have talked about the theory of economic rent. Accumulation is supposed to be out of profits, and what we're seeing today is rent extraction, not productive profits. That's what we're going to be talking about at 3:40 in the same room. But I want to talk about, address the quantitative easing, because that really is the means of accumulation today. The Federal Reserve can create an infinite amount of money that it lends to banks at 1/4 of 1 percentage point. The banks can then borrow at 1/4 and buy every bond in the world, every factory in the world, every corporation in the world, every bit of land in the world that yields more than 1/4%. So they can do all this until you get the entire economic surplus being paid as interest, and it's all absorbed in interest. The question is, how far can this go? That was one of the questions. We know how far it can go because we have a perfect scale model before us, the Roman Empire. everything in the Roman Empire was turned into a payment of interest. All the major historians, Livy, Diodorus, Plutarch, all said it was the creditors who took over. All of the surplus in land and commerce was pledged for credit. The result was the Dark Age. Population fell even more than it did in Latvia, even more immigrants than you had from Iceland. You have a whole shrinkage of this. So the answer is that once you have the entire economic surplus paid as interest, then the whole system collapses. And that's the tendency of primitive accumulation. Asset stripping and looting is short-term. The finance capital has always been short-term. Marx expected finance capital to become long-term and to be integrated with the profit-seeking process, but instead finance capital in the United States and Europe has integrated with real estate in the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, and the monopolies. And so you have, the financial process has become part of the asset stripping process and primitive accumulation, not industrial accumulation as Marx had hoped.
Wow, what amazing discussion period. I will not do justice to all of the points that were raised, but in sort of some quick telegraphic order, beginning, Radhika, with your comments. I think Marx is naturalistic when he assumes that there's no issue around the rate of population growth. But I think you're right that when he enters into more micro reflections, there's a lot of very interesting subtlety in there that we can build on. And really that's what I was trying to do with the Ireland part of the discussion. I really agree with what you say about services. We have a tendency to assume that when we talk about labor in the service sector, it's not industrial. And yet, when I walk into a McDonald's, and I have children, which is why I have to sometimes walk into a McDonald's, I must tell you, what I see with the production of a Big Mac is assembly line production. You know, that's what it looks like to me. And the fact that it's not a huge industrial complex, but there's maybe 8-10 people working behind that counter with a very clear division of labor. They've all been task timed and so on. To me, a lot of what we describe as services is really industrial labor that is simply often just meant for personal consumption rather than purposes of accumulation. Two other points. War is clearly a mechanism of enormous destruction of capital, and I don't think one can ever discount it as such a mechanism. I think the truth is that absent a hugely destructive war and absent a hugely destructive depression, and for all kinds of reasons, I think central banks are highly allergic to the direction of a massively destructive global depression right now, basically because they think the financial system will collapse the way that it began to in 08, 09. They have a dilemma. There are at least 50 unnecessary auto plants in the world. Okay? There are 50 plants that should be closed, destroyed. We're talking several 100 million tons of excess steel capacity in the world today. In order to revitalize capitalism, all of these factories, steel mills, and so on would have to close so that then there could be a new investment boom by those who remain to essentially struggle over the world market. In the absence of that, and I think we're going to see the absence of that for quite some considerable period of time, we're talking about a long stretched out new normal with much higher rates of unemployment, particularly for young people, with an ongoing austerity war against social programs, minimum wages, unions, and so on. And we've already, we've been in this 5 years now. I remember the first Left Forum in 2008 where we first started to talk about this because Bear Stearns had just collapsed while the Left Forum was meeting 5 years ago. And we're now 5 years into this. I think we'll be having this conversation in 5 years' time, because I see the whole thing is stretched out. And this new normal, I think one of the key limits, going back to my comment earlier on Ruth's comment, is I don't believe that 64% youth unemployment in Greece is sustainable. I don't believe that 50% plus youth unemployment in Spain is sustainable, politically sustainable. Never mind the economic dynamics of it. And it's why I think that we're seeing, if you will, a convergence of political revolts which are simultaneously generational. That is to say, there's a youth dynamic to them, if you look who's in Taksim Square right now. But also, it's about precarious labor. These young people are not just students, although they may be students. This intersection of youth and precarious labor today means that we're seeing certain sections of the working class that are rebelling around all kinds of conditions of life and labor. And Michael mentioned our recent trip to Slovenia, and I'll conclude on this. This is who we saw across the Balkans. We saw the young generation from Slovenia and Serbia and Croatia. And by the way, while we were there, they launched in Slovenia the first new left movement since the Civil War. It's called the Initiative for Democratic Socialism. And it's coming out of precisely this layer of young people. And I think really what we're talking about is also the question of, can a new left based on these young activists be constituted in the next period of time, which will regenerate the left internationally? Thank you.
Why no collapse? Why is stretching out?
Because with zero interest rates, why does capital have to go under?